Okay, good evening, everybody. Hopefully, you could hear me okay. Um, enjoying some of the nice weather that we have here in Duluth, and enjoying the summer. Speaking of the summer, next week there will not be a class. It's going to be the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. It's a fast day, and it's actually prohibited to study Torah on the 9th of Av because it's supposed to be a sad day, and the Torah brings us joy. So we will not be having a class next week. So it'll be 2 weeks till our next class. Um, let's get into it. So let's do some joyous Torah learning. So in this week's Torah portion, we begin the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim. Now, in the book of Devarim is essentially the longest sermon in the history of the rabbinate. Moses says he's not going to enter the land of Israel, and so 1 month before he passed away, he says, "I'm going to review all the things that we talked about," and that's what he does. He talks for a month, and one of the things that he describes all the things and all the laws that we had already gone through. So it says that one of the things that Moses does is that he bi'er es haTorah hazos, right on the edge of the Jordan River, about to cross into the land of Israel. He explains the Torah. So our sages tell us, specifically Rashi explains, what does it mean that he explained the Torah? So Rashi says he explained it in 70 languages. So in other words, Moses translates the Torah into 70 languages, and we'll talk about that more a little later about Moses' translation. It's not extant, we don't have it, but Moses really brought the Torah down essentially into the level of day-to-day life. That's what he was doing. We'll talk about that more a little later. So, but we have another very interesting translation of the Torah that's also we're going to discuss today. 989 years after the translation of the Torah by Moses, the Torah was translated again. This time it was translated by the Greek king. It was actually the Egyptian king of the Greek dynasty. A little complex. The Greeks kind of split into five, right? So one of them is the Ptolemaic kingdom, led by King Ptolemy, and he gathered 72 sages, and he locked them in 72 rooms, and he asked them to translate the Torah, and it's known as the Septuagint. He translated it into Greek. So our sages tell us that all the sages decided, each individual, they didn't have the opportunity to consult with each other. They all decided to change 13 different places where to translate not the exact meaning, right? So there's the expression "take me seriously, not literally," right? So that was kind of what they were doing. We'll talk about a little later exactly the changes that they made. And the Torah tells us that this translation was it was not a good thing. Our sages tell us that in fact the day that the Torah was translated, this Septuagint was called the Septuagint because of the 70 plus sages who had translated it. And even though there was a tremendous miracle involved, right, where all the sages, even though not consulting with each other, made the exact same translations of the meaning, not the literal, it was considered such a terrible day. Our sages tell us it was as difficult as the day as the golden calf was made. Now, if we think about it, that's a pretty extreme statement, right? To say that the Torah being translated into Greek is as bad as the Torah being as the day that the golden calf was made, right? The golden calf is one of the worst sins in the history of the world, right? It's like top two, right? Right after the sin of the eating of the tree of knowledge, right? That it brought sin back into the world after the Jewish people were given the Torah 40 days later. And we're going to say that that's what the translated Torah is. So in order to understand this, we're going to have to, first of all, we're going to know the story in the Talmud. We have story number one, and we have story number two about Hillel and Shammai. So Hillel and Shammai were two Jewish sages who were both, they were colleagues. They were both students of Shmaya and Avtalion, who were, this was at the era of where two Jewish leaders led the Jewish people. There used to be only one Jewish leader, and this time during the Second Temple period, there was two. One of them was the head of the Sanhedrin. One of them was called the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. The other one was called the Av Beis Din, the head of the court. And the other one was like the leader. They had different roles, but really what happened is that there was different. They had different opinions, and so this is where really the idea of not having all Jews follow one rabbinic voice started. At any rate, the Talmud tells us that that there were two schools of thought. There were the students of Hillel and the student of Shammai, and the students of Hillel. A voice came out from heaven and said that the students of Hillel are always correct, even though they're both the words of God. Both of what they're saying is holy, and in some cosmic level, they're both true. But the law has to follow only one person, so the law always follows the laws of the house of Hillel, the students of Hillel. Why? Because both of them are very smart. Both of them are very but the thing was about the students of Hillel over the students of Shammai is that they were humble. And the students of Hillel, before they would teach their rulings, they would teach the rulings of the school of Shammai. So when they would teach, they would first teach the rulings of the school of Shammai, and then they would teach their own ruling. It showed in their humility that they didn't think that they were the only game out there. And so therefore, this humility led to the Jewish people being of the rabbis following specifically the halachas like that. But there was a story. At one time, there was a sage. His name was Rabbi Hananiah, the son of Chizkiah, and Rabbi Hananiah, the son of Chizkiah ben Garain. That when the sages would visit him, they said they realized that there were more students of Shammai than there were students of Hillel, and they went to his attic and they put a sword in front of the academy, and they said nobody's allowed in and nobody's allowed out. And they realized because the law is that we follow the majority, right? And usually the students besides the fact that we follow the students of Hillel because of, like we said, of their humility and that a voice came from heaven, but the practical reason they followed them was also that they were a majority. Right? The Torah tells us to follow the majority. So at that day, though, the students of Shammai were majority, and they ruled in 18 different things. And eventually Hillel himself accepted these rulings, that they were actually correct, that these 18 rulings. However, the Talmud says that this event was difficult for the Jewish people as the day of the golden calf was made. Right? Very similar language to our story about the Septuagint. And again, the question is, how can we say that this is such a terrible thing? Even though, yes, the law usually follows the rulings of the house of Hillel, but in this case, Hillel himself submitted that these were correct, and it wasn't like this was a hostile takeover, and this was the way it was from then on. It was just for that day. So, when it comes, if we go if we focus on the language of these two stories and the language of the day the golden calf was made, we have to go back to the story of the golden calf. The golden calf was made, and the Torah tells us that Aaron was involved, and he was trying to convince the Jewish people, don't do anything. Tomorrow is going to be a holiday for the Lord, right? A holiday for God. And meaning not for the golden calf. And he said, come back tomorrow. And he was hoping by then Moses would come, people would have time to sleep on it and realize their mistake, right? That they were trying to make a new Moses, so to speak, somebody to lead them. But they would realize that the real Moses would come, and it would be all good. But that's not what happened, right? The next day they woke up early and they worshipped the golden calf, and it was idolatry. And we all know what happened. Moses breaks the tablets, and he has to beg God for forgiveness. So the Jewish people said, but going back to the language, it doesn't say that. So there were two different days. There was the day that they made the golden calf, and there was the day they served the golden calf. That was the next day. So the day the Talmud, when it talks about these two stories, doesn't say the day that they served the golden calf. It says they made the golden calf. So and we see that when did God tell Moses, the people have gone wayward? Not when they made the golden calf. God didn't go to Moses and say, you got to go back, right? You got to get out of here. The Jewish people are sinning. God does that the next day, the day they serve the golden calf, not the day they made the golden calf. So so let's understand a little bit. What was the problem, right? The problem was that the Jewish people said they want a new leader, right? Moses was gone. He hadn't come back after 39 and a half days, whatever it was. And Moses was done. And now we need a new leader. But the truth is that through this situation of the golden calf, even though it was a very bad situation and led to some really terrible consequences, what would have happened had they actually followed Aaron's advice, and they would have instead the next day served God instead of serving the golden calf, and realized that Moses is the true leader of the Jewish people, right? That not that we don't need some sort of representation of God, but we need someone to help us connect to God, right? We needed Moses, who was a person, not that we didn't worship Moses. Moses was a connector, right? He connected us to God. He brought the Torah to us. He enabled us to worship God. Not that we worship what ends up happening. Instead, they follow the leader of the golden calf. They worship the golden calf itself, right? But what Aaron wanted to happen would have happened, perhaps it would have brought it if Moses would have come and instead of worshiping the golden calf, they realized that Moses is the true leader. Perhaps what would have happened was they would have actually been more attached to Moses. They would have been more attached to God. They would have recognized their mistake, and they would have recognized that God actually took us out of Egypt and we don't need golden calves. Maybe that would have happened, but that's not what happened. So what do we see here is that this idea of making the golden calf was not as bad as we thought. In other words, it was like a cry for help almost, right? It was the Jewish people saying, we want a connection with God. We think that Moses is gone. We think we don't have a leader. We need a connection to God. And it ended up, though, it was a very risky move, and they failed, right? And let's look at the story. So now with that background, let's look at these two stories, right? The Septuagint, let's go to look at two of the things that they changed in the beginning of the Torah. The first thing they changed is actually the first words of the Torah. The Torah starts off, Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created. When they translated as Elokim bara Bereshis, that God created in the beginning, not in the beginning God created. Why? Because they thought that based on the Greek mythologies, that there's always some sort of higher God, right? That the Greeks would say, oh, there's this God called Bereshis. There's a God called in the beginning, right? There's this beginning God, and He created God, right? So in order to avoid that mistake, they didn't translate in the beginning God created. They translated as God created in the beginning. That was the first thing they did. So the second thing that they changed, we're not going to go through all 13, we'll just go, the second thing they changed is that it says that when God creates man, God says, Na'aseh Adam. God says, let us make man, right? Our sages tell us, what do you mean, let us make man? That God, in His humility, decided to consult the angels, right? To kind of say, like, as if they had an option of an opinion, right? And that was God showing His humility. But again, that could lead to a mistake, right? That the Greeks would say, oh, you translated, let us make man. See, there's more than one God. There's these demigods, whatever they call them. So what we see here is that both of these stories, I'm sorry, and this story, we didn't get to the second story yet, but this story shows on that there was a really bad potential. Not that it ended up being bad, right? The Septuagint had a really bad potential, just like the day that the golden calf was created. Not that it was served, right? It wasn't that bad, but it led to the potential of the opposite of God's oneness, right? Which is what happened by the golden calf. It was the potential for the opposite of God's oneness. So that's why the Septuagint was so bad. And let's go to the second story, the story of Hillel and Shammai. The story of Hillel and Shammai is that day led to a tremendous problem where it could be that there would have been a hostile takeover, and the rabbis would have said, okay, from now on, made 18 rulings in the favor of Shammai versus Hillel, that they would have said, okay, from now on, the law follows Shammai. That's what we've established today. And that's why it was such a terrible day like the day that the golden calf was made, because there was a potential for something really negative to happen here, right? And what's so bad about the rulings following Shammai versus Hillel? If we know there's both, they're both competent rabbis, right? They were both leaders of the Jewish people. Is that the school of Hillel followed their tendencies were towards kindness, and therefore they actually ruled more leniently in most places, versus the school of Shammai was severity. And we know that the world cannot exist in such a way where there's absolute truth and there's no room for nuance, right? That was the view of Shammai. So therefore, it would have been a really bad thing. The world cannot be sustained in such a reality where there's no room for nuance. Now, in result, however, we see that the thing didn't happen, right? That it didn't become we didn't change the rules of the Torah and say, okay, from now on, we're following the rules of Shammai from now on. In fact, if we look at this, we can see that perhaps it actually had an effect on the school of Shammai by including them, that we see that there are a few places where Shammai rules, the school of Shammai rules more leniently. So in other words, by bringing them into that idea of that sometimes the law follows them, they actually were taught about this idea of compassion and kindness. And they also had this. It also affected them the same way that Hillel submitted himself to Shammai. He was showing how they could submit themselves to the rulings of Hillel as well. So now, what's the bottom line, right? What does it have to do with us? So we'll finish off with a story about the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, told the story that one time he had what's called an Aliyas Hanashama, his soul went on high, and while he was going through these holy worlds, he went into the chamber of Mashiach, the chamber of the Messiah, and he spoke to him, and he said, "When are you coming? When is the Messiah going to come? When is Mashiach going to come?" And he said, "When your well springs will go to the outside," meaning when the teachings of Chassidus, your teachings of Chassidism, of teaching of the oneness of God, when they will be taught to every single person, to every single Jew, every single outsider, so to speak, who's not inside right now, that's when Mashiach will come. And when they heard this idea, many of the Hasidic masters cried, right? It says even some places that the Baal Shem Tov himself cried when he heard this, because they realized how difficult it would be, right? That teaching esoteric Hasidic teachings, teaching that to people who are quote unquote outside, not to other Hasidic masters, not to their students, but to the outsiders, that would be a very difficult thing. And that means Mashiach is not going to be immediately, right? It's already been almost 300 years since the Baal Shem Tov's times. So what is the connection between that and what was going on here? Is that even though that translating things, right, into other languages, which is how we started this, can be risky business, right? Things can be mistranslated and it could be used for bad. And teaching the Hasidic teachings to quote unquote outsiders, that could potentially, teaching very holy special things to outsiders could potentially have negative things, and is a very difficult task. However, by the Baal Shem Tov taught us, and really what Moses taught us by translating the Torah into all 70 languages, is that every single one of these teachings has relevance to us and has relevance to all things in all times, not just a relevance to that time or only those who speak the Hebrew language, right? But by bringing the Hasidic teachings and these esoteric, deep teachings of the Torah, by bringing it to every single person, whether they're quote unquote an insider or an outsider, that is maybe risky, right? Just like it was risky making the golden calf, and that failed. But we see other times in Jewish history where the big risks were taken. The risk of translating the Torah into Greek, the risk of the rulings of one day following the school of Shammai. But what it actually does is it brought something out even deeper. It brought something even more special, right? So in other words, that these days, these quote unquote days that were as bad as the day that the golden calf was created, were really super like nuclear power, right? Super risky, super risky. But the reward is nuclear energy, right? That's the reward, is something that could power us even further, right? So even the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, was one of the pioneers in translating Hasidic teachings into other languages. Used to be Hasidic teachings were only translated into Hebrew. They were only in Hebrew, and he printed beginning into Yiddish, right? That he said it's not enough that it's in Hebrew, which is the language of scholars. So it had to be into the vernacular, and eventually they were translated into English and many other languages as we see today. But really, what it is that all these and what it did was, even though it might have been a difficult task to translate super deep esoteric teachings of the Torah, and there's a super big risk involved, but the reward is super great. Wishing everybody a good Shabbos, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.